My daughter-in-law sent one message to the family group chat, and by the time I finished reading it, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to say a word, not one. The message was this. Just heard from a contact at the county. Ellie's lake house is going into foreclosure proceedings next week. Starting bid probably around $400,000. Daddy already talked to his real estate guy. We're moving fast. 3 fire emojis, a champagne bottle, and then 20 minutes later, a follow-up from her. Father, Don Way, confirmed, $230,000 ready. Let's get this done. I sat on the back porch with my coffee getting cold in my hands, and I read those messages 3 times. The lake was flat that morning, fog sitting on the water the way it does in October, quiet and total. My name is Ella Laner Marsh. Ellie to people who've known me a long time or people who think they have. I'm 66 years old. I spent 22 years as a financial analyst before I retired, and my late husband Frank and I paid off this lake house in Mill Haven, Vermont 18 months ago in full. $1.1 million. I have the paperwork in a folder in my filing cabinet, alphabetized, right between the property tax receipts and the homeowner's insurance policy. There was no foreclosure. There was no auction. There was nothing. What there was my daughter-in-law Kristen, who had decided, apparently for quite some time, that I was a confused old woman sitting on an asset I didn't deserve to keep. The thing is, I'd seen it. Building. I just hadn't done anything about it because I kept believing the situation would correct itself, that Garrett would say something, that Kristen would eventually stop. But narcissistic boundary violations, the actual psychological term, they don't self-correct. They escalate. Every time you absorb the hit without consequence, you teach the other person that the floor is lower than they thought. They go lower. I had taught Kristen that floor for 3 years. Now I was done. I put down my coffee, went inside to my home office, and called the bank. My contact there was a man named Warren Schultz. Not a teller, not a branch manager, a senior relationship officer. I'd worked with Warren since I opened my accounts there in 2009. He picked up on the second ring. Eleanor, good to hear from you. I kept my voice even. I told him I'd heard some rumors circulating in my family about the lake house and I wanted official documentation confirming the property status and mortgage payoff. I also carefully precisely described what Kristen had written in the chat and mentioned that a third party had already wired funds in anticipation of an auction that didn't exist. Warren was quiet for a moment. That's Eleanor. That's a serious situation. If someone is collecting funds under the misrepresentation that your property is available for purchase, that's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. I'll have a confirmation letter drafted today. Certified letterhead, property lien status, full payoff confirmation. And Warren, I said, if anyone contacts the bank directly asking about this property, an auction, foreclosure proceedings, anything, I want you to handle it personally. He understood exactly what I meant. Here is the legal reality that most people don't know, and it's worth pausing on because what Kristen's father, Don, had just done by wiring $230,000 in anticipation of a non-existent foreclosure auction was not just embarrassing. Depending on the chain of representations that led to that wire, it could be characterized as participation in a fraudulent transaction, even if Don himself was deceived. Money wired in connection with a property transaction that cannot proceed gets frozen in escrow while the title company and bank verify what happened. That freeze can take weeks, sometimes months. You cannot just call the bank and say, whoops, wire it back. There is a process. There is paperwork. There is the distinct possibility of a formal inquiry. Kristen didn't know any of that. She had sent those fire emojis thinking the house would be hers by Friday. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled the folder. 2 days passed. Garrett called, my son, 38 years old, Kristen's husband, and said vaguely that he'd heard there was some confusion about my finances. He sounded uncomfortable. He sounded like a man reading from a script someone else had written. No confusion on my end, I said pleasantly. How are you both? He paused. Kristen thinks she's worried about you, Mom. She says the house might be Garrett. I'm fine. I'll talk to you soon. And I hung up. That same afternoon, Kristen came home early. She and Garrett were staying in the guest room that week, which I now recognized as reconnaissance, not a visit, and she tried to log into the Wi-Fi. It didn't work. She came into the living room where I was reading. Eleanor, is the internet down? I removed the guest network, I said without looking up. I need the full bandwidth for some financial reporting I'm doing. She stared at me. You're your financial reporting. The way she said it, the particular specific contempt in the pause before financial, like the words didn't fit together, like the idea of me having financial work was a category error, something between absurd and irritating. Garrett said you hadn't worked in years. Garrett said a lot of things, I said, not all of them accurate. She left the room. I heard her on the phone with her father a few minutes later, voice low and fast. I didn't try to listen. I didn't need to. What I'd realized, and this took me longer than it should have, I'll admit that, was that Kristen's entire model of me had been built on a foundation of Garrett's careless descriptions. The not very tech-savvy mom, the kind of out-of-it-since-dad died widow, the woman who lets bills pile up and doesn't really understand investment accounts. None of that was true. But Garrett had said it probably offhandedly, probably years ago, and Kristen had built a whole architecture of assumptions on top of it. An architecture that now had a $230,000 wire transfer sitting at the top of it. This is how financial elder manipulation actually works in families. Not always through dramatic schemes, but through accumulated dismissals. Through 100 small moments where someone's competence is quietly erased from the family narrative. By the time the real move comes, nobody in the room thinks to question it because the story of the confused old woman has already been told so many times it feels like fact. I knew this story. I just hadn't corrected it until now. The day of the so-called auction arrived. It was a Tuesday. I made oatmeal and read the news and fed the 2 ducks that come to the dock every morning. Gerald and Miriam, I'd named them, which was a ridiculous thing to do, and I stand by it completely. Frank would have done the same. Garrett and Kristen were up early, unusual for them. I heard Kristen on the phone multiple times. She was dressed like she had somewhere to be. Her father, Don, was apparently driving up from Hartford 3 hours to be there for the signing. I said nothing. I made a second cup of coffee. At 10:47 a.m., my phone rang. Warren Schultz. Ella Lehner, it's happened. Miss Kristen Marsh arrived at the branch approximately 40 minutes ago with her father, and I'm going to be diplomatic here, a fair amount of confidence. She asked to speak to someone about the foreclosure auction on the Millhaven property. We told her there was no foreclosure auction. She insisted. We brought in our branch director. I want you to know I handled it personally as you requested. I could hear in his voice that he'd enjoyed it just a little. Her father's wire, I said, is sitting in a holding account pending clarification of the transaction purpose. It cannot be released until we complete our verification process. That will take, he paused, choosing his words, some time. Thank you, Warren. The branch director did tell Mr. Donahue, that's her father, correct? That misrepresenting the status of a third party's property to solicit funds could potentially be referred to our compliance team for review. I sat down my coffee cup very carefully. He said that he did. Mr. Dona was quite upset. He's been on the phone with his attorney since approximately 11. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment looking at the lake. There was something moving through me that I don't have a clean word for. Not quite satisfaction and not quite sadness, but something that sits between them. The particular feeling of a thing resolving the way it was always going to resolve once you stopped trying to prevent it from happening. Kristen came back to the house at 1230. She didn't slam the door. That was the first surprise. She walked in quietly, set her bag down, and sat at the kitchen table without saying anything. I let the silence sit. Finally, the bank said. They said you paid it off. All of it. Yes, I said. When? 18 months ago. June. She was quiet again. I could see her recalibrating, pulling apart the story. She'd built, looking for where the error was. The look on her face wasn't quite shame. It was closer to confusion. The specific confusion of someone who has been absolutely certain of something for years and has just discovered the certainty was built on nothing. My dad's money is in escrow. I said he'll need to work with the bank to sort that out. That process exists because wire fraud, wiring funds in connection with a misrepresented property transaction, is taken very seriously by financial institutions. Even when the person sending the wire believed they were acting in good faith, I wasn't threatening her. I was informing her. There's a difference. She heard it as a threat. I watched her face tighten. And to be clear, I didn't do anything to cause Dawn's money to be frozen. The bank's compliance process did that automatically the moment someone showed up claiming to purchase a property that had just been confirmed as privately owned and debt-free. I had simply made sure the right person at the bank was informed so the situation was handled correctly. That evening, Garrett came and sat across from me without Kristen. That was the second surprise. He looked, I don't know, smaller than usual. Not in a bad way exactly, more like a man who has had something very large and wrong removed from his perception and is now seeing the actual room. I didn't know, he said about the mortgage. I didn't know you'd paid it off. I know you didn't. She said Kristen kept saying you were going to lose it. That you hadn't made payments in months. She said she'd seen documents. He stopped. I believed her. I didn't. I should have asked you. Yes, I said. You should have. I thought you were. He stopped again. Out of it, I said, since your father died. Not really managing, not really understanding money. He didn't deny it. That was actually better than denial. It meant something had cracked open in him. Where did that come from, Garrett? That picture of me. He thought about it. Genuinely thought. I don't know. It became the story. And Kristen kept she made it sound so certain. I told him then. Not everything, but enough. I told him about the 22 years of analysis work, the clients, the portfolio management. I told him about the life insurance from Frank, $300,000 that I'd held in a conservative index account for 4 years before I decided the time was right to clear the mortgage. I told him about Warren Schultz and the relationship I had with that bank and the letter sitting in my filing cabinet. He listened, really listened, the way he hadn't in a long time. I'm not bailing anyone out of this, I said at the end. Dawn's money situation, the escrow, the compliance review, that's between them and the bank. I love you, Garrett, and that doesn't change. But I've spent 3 years being a woman you and your wife thought was too simple to notice what was happening around her. That's done. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was maybe the most important moment of the whole thing. Not the bank call, not the frozen escrow, not Kristen sitting at my kitchen table recalibrating her entire worldview, just my son looking at me and not arguing. Don got his money back eventually after 6 weeks and a formal written clarification and 2 conversations with the bank's compliance officer. Kristen and he had a very bad month. I know this because Garrett told me in pieces over several phone calls where he was relearning how to talk to me. Kristen and I exist now in what I'd call a careful arrangement. She is polite. I am polite. She does not make assumptions about my finances. I do not require her to apologize because an apology she doesn't mean is worth exactly nothing. And I have learned to stop wanting things that are worth nothing. The guest Wi-Fi is still off. Gerald and Miriam come to the dock every morning. The fog sits on the lake and then the sun burns it away and then the water is very blue and very clear, the way water gets in Vermont in October when everything is finally completely honest. I take my coffee outside and I watch that happen and I think, yeah, I think this is mine. It always was.